Um, I know we live in Barrington, or in this area, so it's not the most cultured area. But has anyone been to an art gallery in the past year? All right, so we have a few really special people. My last time in an art gallery, it's been quite a while, but this is me staring at these magnificent works of art. Half of them I look at and I ask, most of the time is just internally, sometimes it will get verbalized. What is that? Right? Some art I'm tuned into, it's a farmhouse, there's a field and a mountain. I get that. But when we slide into what's actually more artistic, expressing something of the inner heart or thoughts of the artist, it's hard for me to connect. Where others just are absolutely drawn right into the beauty of something that's a little bit more abstract. But wherever you are on that spectrum, whether you need a clear painting or whether something a little more ambiguous really captures you, can you think of a time that a piece of art has just drawn you in? And you find yourself staring and taking it in, and it's the beauty, it's the creativity, it's the message of the art, that there's something about it that just pulls you in. Or maybe it's a poem. Maybe it's a poem that you memorized as a kid that has stuck with you, or one that you have up on your wall, or something that you heard audibly that you're like, that's it. Those thoughts are amazing. The way that the moon in the heavenlies, or whatever your poem is expressing. Or maybe it's a song. A song that dips into our soul somewhere deeper than a propositional statement can. All of this to say, sometimes, maybe most of the time, there are places in our heart, places in ourselves, that truth statements, this is true, don't get to. But a song that erupts with emotions pushes down into those pieces of who we are. I am not the most artistic person. At Penn State, when I was a student there, I was a liberal arts major. So in the liberal arts world, you take all sorts of classes, and so I took an art class. And I was scared to death because I don't have that kind of creativity to express myself artistically. So I decided, you know what? I have to take an art class. I'm going to take metalworking. Okay? So our first assignment in the class, I show up. There's a lot of people. I'm dressed kind of like I'm dressed now, not with a whole lot of spunk or pizzazz. Others, you can tell, well, that's an artist right there, and he's in my class. And we get together, and the professor teaches us and tells us our first assignment is to make a jewelry box out of metal. So I'm like, a jewelry box? All right, this will be cool. So I go back and design the thing and hammer out the metal and learn the different techniques. And I come, and my jewelry box was this big. It was really small, but it had a heart inlaid on the top. I thought it was amazing. Until the other students brought their projects in. And I realized once again, oh, man, art just isn't my thing. And if I'm honest with you, it's one of the reasons that I find that I've avoided preaching the book of Psalms. If you've noticed, if you've been at FCCB for any number of years, you can't pinpoint a series I've done out of the book of Psalms. There's a reason for it. It's been a challenge for me for many years. It's been a challenge to hear, just in my devotional life, poetry, songs, hymns coming from the book of Psalms. because my mind is kind of wired a little differently. I want to break down and find the sentence structure and what's the Greek behind that and what's the statement that we can leverage to create an action step for change in our lives. And Psalms doesn't do that. Psalms, the book of Psalms, is more like the art gallery that is built to be received, perhaps more than analyzed. And so I find it personally, pastorally, a little bit challenging because it can be hard to connect to, which is why there's 2 open weeks this summer. And I said, all right, Lord, let's drop in. And last week we took a look at Psalms chapter 13, where the psalmist literally is screaming out, how long, Lord? And you could feel some of that emotion, right, that the psalmist had. And God, why are you delaying? Is it going to be forever? I don't understand what's going on here. This week I want to invite you to turn to Psalm chapter 48. As we get to just kind of receive an image of the glory of God in the church. The glory of God in the church. And here's what I want to give you before we drop into the song. God does not have an idealized view of His people. Okay? God doesn't somehow gloss over the faults and the sin and the bad choices that His people make. So I don't want you to receive this psalm thinking God is just kind of ignoring some of the bad stuff that I know about His people. The reason I say that is I'm working my way through the scriptures this year. Right now I'm in the book of Jeremiah. And oftentimes, I'll listen instead of reading, because like I said, I tend to analyze. And sometimes listening, I can't analyze, I just receive it, and so it's healthy for me. And so I was listening this week, one morning, to the book of Jeremiah. I don't have headphones on, so it's just kind of playing. And Sienna came down. And she kind of sat on the couch with me, and so now she's hearing Jeremiah. And first question that she asks is, why is God so angry? And my impulse was to be, sweetie, God's not angry. Until I realized, what a brilliant question. She nailed it. God is really angry with His people. And so the prophets have this side that we see that God knows His people well. God understands you and I. God knows His people Israel. He sees all the idol worship. He sees all the ways that they've walked away from His commands. He sees the darkness of their hearts, and yet He's in love with them. Okay? What we read in Psalm 48 is not some idealized view of God's people. It is God with His people in full view, where we see that His glory is still resident with His people, which is amazing. Psalm 48, let me read it, and then we'll just take a few pieces of the picture here. Great is the Lord, and most worthy of praise, in the city of our God, His holy mountain. It is beautiful in its loftiness, the joy of the whole earth. Like the utmost heights of Zaphon is Mount Zion, the city of the great King. God is in her citadels. He has shown Himself to be her fortress. When the kings joined forces, when they advanced together, they saw her and were astounded. They fled in terror. Trembling seized them there, pain like that of a woman in labor. You destroyed them like ships of Tarshish, shattered by an east wind. As we have heard, so have we seen. In the city of the Lord Almighty, in the city of our God, God makes her secure forever. Within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgments. Walk about Zion. Go around her. Count her towers. Consider well her ramparts. View her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. For this God is our God, forever and ever. He will be our guide, even to the end. I think the very first picture on the wall here in our gallery is that God, the King, dwells with his people. God, the King, dwells among his people. And we get this great imagery in the first 3 verses of a city and how great the Lord is and how worthy of praise he is. But the highlight is that God is in the city. That's what the psalmist is putting out. This fact that the sovereign, the king, is in the city with his people, protecting and fortifying them. And he uses different words, different pictures, different images. He calls it the city of our God, his holy mountain, Mount Zion, the city of the great king. And all of these pictures in our art gallery all kind of wrap around the city of Jerusalem. That's the imagery that we'd be receiving. And Jerusalem is centered around the temple and the presence of the Lord of Heaven's armies residing in the temple. When you think Jerusalem, if you're one of the people singing this psalm, you're not just thinking Jerusalem, you're thinking Israel. Jerusalem is the picture of Israel. And if you're one of God's people, you're not just thinking Israel, you're thinking the whole of God's people. The people that God delights in. And this whole psalm is capturing the picture of the whole of the people of God. Which then we begin to interpret, if God is in the city, and the city is representative ultimately of all of God's people, then God is residing with his people. That God has taken residence up with his people. Those of you who have been to London certainly have visited Buckingham Palace, right? And so Buckingham, maybe like other residences of kings and queens around the world, they have this tradition. When the Queen of England is in residence, there's a particular flag that goes up. And it just signifies to all the people, hey, the Queen is in residence here. And when she goes over to Wales or she goes over to another residence, the flag goes up indicating she's here, the Queen is here. And other nations would be the King is here. And the psalmist is singing out this amazing truth that the flag of the King in residence is right here in his church. Right here among God's people. God is enthroned in the midst of his people. Another version says, beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion in the far north, which is pointing to the heavens itself. And it goes like this. The Lord is great, and so he ought to be praised greatly in the city, Jerusalem, the city of our God, his holy mountain. Jerusalem, the city of God, is beautiful in her height and her elevation, and the joy of all the earth in the far north, like unto heaven. She is the city of the great King. And then in verse 3, God reveals himself to be her stronghold, her dwelling and a protection in her palaces. And the whole point of this picture is to give God's people, you and I, this amazing piece of comfort. The King is here. The King has taken up residence with his people. His flag is flying above his people. It's to comfort his people. with the greatness of God and the nearness of God. And here's one thing I think we walk away from this picture in the gallery. I think we walk away from it with this thought, that great thoughts about God are necessary to worship God. We can't worship God if we don't have great thoughts about God. And great thoughts about who God is, about our sovereign King, are important for right thoughts about ourselves. Great thoughts about God are necessary for us to worship God, but great thoughts about God are necessary for right views of ourselves. Meaning, I'm not the king in residence, but there is one who is. We can't worship God without great thoughts about God, and we can't have a right view of ourselves if we don't have a view of the greatness of God. And this is why this morning we sang about King Jesus. This is why I make reference quite often about King Jesus, because I think it's important for us. We have to have a good view, a good picture of the greatness of God and the greatness of our King Jesus, who rescues us from darkness, who rules and defends over us, and this King Jesus, who conquers all of his and our enemies. And he moves on, kind of the second part of the picture, beginning in verse 4, when he starts talking about the enemies of God's people. When the kings joined forces, when they advanced together, they saw her and were astounded. They fled in terror. Trembling seized them there. Pain like that of a woman in labor. You and I are living in a day right now that is not what in theology terms we call the eschaton. That's a fancy word for saying kind of the last days, the days to come, the day of the Lord, final eternity, heaven. Because we're not living in those days, we're living in days that Jesus has enemies. And they're alive. And they're well. And they hate what Jesus is doing among the earth. And one of the quests is to stop the advancement of his people, his church. We're reminded in the New Testament that our enemy is not flesh and blood, but it's spiritual powers, that we have an enemy behind the scenes looking to thwart and defeat God's people. It's why Psalm 48 is typically in the higher church a song sung on Pentecost. Pentecost pictures, man, the church is moving forward, the Spirit is here, He's upon His people, He's equipping them for God's mission. So let's sing Psalm 48, because the King is in residence and the enemies can't stop His people. And I love the portrait given here, okay? So go back with me to the art gallery. How do you picture that scene? Verses 4 to 8. It's a bunch of kings conspiring. How long have they conspired? We don't know. They got together. Hey, we should go attack Jerusalem. Yeah, I'm in. Let's call King Zabo. Yeah, I'm in too. And they conspire. They get all their armies and they march and the sound of the footsteps are coming. And then I just picture the scene. They come up over the ridge. And they get the first sight of the buildings of Jerusalem. And the highest point there is a piece of the temple. And the kings catch that. And the description is beautiful. They scream like women in labor. They scream like a girl. And my portrait on the wall here is one of these mighty kings dressed for battle with loads of men and horses behind them, just beginning to turn and to run with their eyes wide open and their mouths screaming. And chaos erupting in their troops because they've just caught sight of the city of God where the king is. Now, you may not view yourself quite that way. The people may not scream in terror when they come upon the church. You may not view yourself as part of a people so strong that enemies flee. You may potentially see yourself, if it's authority, I've got more like a Barney Fife feel going on. Maybe I've got a small-time captain of the guard sense. I want you to receive this picture differently. God promises in his picture, in the psalm, that because God is in the city, victory is yours. Because God has taken up residence in his people, victory is ours. We sang about the resurrection. That was a beautiful introduction. That victory belongs to Jesus in every area of life and even death itself. That victory has already been planted and it belongs to his people. And there is one day that God's enemies will flee in terror because they recognize the King is with his people. And we've got no chance. I don't think God's church needs the latest gimmick. I don't think God's church needs to chase after the latest trend. We don't need the most popular author with the most popular book that we all buy into. What God's church desperately needs is to know that the King is here and he's given the church victory simply because he loves his church. He loves his bride. I mean, you and I get to see the warts and the hurts of the church, right? We all recognize the church is not perfect. The church is not glorious in and of ourselves. The church is not frightening because of who we are. We have a front row seat to the failings of the church. We probably talk about it more often than we should. Behind each other's back and some gossip and this didn't go well and she said that and I don't want anything to do. We have a front row seat to the fact that we are not a perfect people. And yet we also have a front row seat to see that God has decreed her destiny and that God himself has ordained victory for this fallen people he calls his church, his city. And that's the second part of this picture. Verse 9 starts us with another image. Within your temple, O God, we meditate on your unfailing love. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgments. This is the people of God in worship. They gather in corporate worship to remember the person and the work and the character and the nature of the God that they're serving. And he rattles off like really quickly 6 different things about God that his people worship. The first one is his hesed, which we talked about last week. That's his covenant love, his loving kindness, his faithfulness to the covenants that he made from the love he has. It is the character of God that people in the Old Testament celebrated most. That God's hesed is here with his people. And we can trust him because of this covenant love. Then he celebrates his nearness. He's in the midst of the temple. He's close to his people. They celebrate together his name, like your name, O God. God's name is his reputation, and they've dwelt on the glory of who God is, and his name represents that, and together they're lifting it up. Like your name, O God, your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. They're celebrating his renown, his fame, his praise. that God's glory is unsurpassed in all the earth. And then they celebrate his righteousness. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Your God always does what is right. There's no scenario where God mars his righteousness. You can trust him. And finally, they celebrate his judgment. Mount Zion rejoices. The villages of Judah are glad because of your judgment, because there will be a day of vindication and glory for God's people as enemies are brought to justice. And in the last piece of the song, beginning in verse 12, he has this amazing way to end the painting, end the poem. Because we're not to take God's glory in and God's residence with his people in for ourselves, but rather, there's a generation coming who needs to know this. There's a generation behind us that is desperate to know God is in her city and God's people has the glory of God dwelling with them. And he writes, walk about Zion. Go around, count her towers. And the poem changes to this imperative voice. It's the glory of God, his city, of his people. It's not to be held for ourselves, but go notice the details. Go check out the towers. Go spend some time with God. Go check out his people. Go see the citadels. See the wall. Count the windows. Take in all the details. Consider well her ramparts. View her citadels, that you may tell of them to the next generation. Which leaves us standing in that art gallery, I think, wondering, what do our kids think of the church? What do our kids think of the church? It's a brilliant question. Have I, as a pastor, as a dad, as a man, passed on a proper image of the church to my kids? That God's glory is resident in his church? Or have I, as a pastor, man, a father, passed on all sorts of whispering and complaints and how useless the church is and how hard and how difficult the people are and I don't know why, this and that? Is that the conversation we pass on to our children? Because those are two different pictures. Yes, we see the pain. Yes, when I was in need, someone didn't minister to me. Yes, there was a fault. There was something that was said and it hurt really deep and it was bad. And yes, I expected this and got that. And yes, there's hurt in the church. But what we're encouraged to pass on is, it's not the people we're looking at. It's God's love for these people that we're supposed to be passing on to our kids. Because no one else will. No one else will. And I think it's all dependent upon what do we see in the church. Do we see these four walls, this building that always needs repair? Do we see the stories where we failed one another? Or do we have eyes to take in this picture that the sons of Korah give us? The city is glorious. The church is glorious for this one reason. God is near and God is good and God is her king. One of my best friends passed away short time ago. He was a pastor at Tri-City, and I'll never forget the story that Tom gave to me. I've used it since, but it's his, so I'll give him credit. Tom said, one day we were just chatting, and he was telling me about how he used to go golfing at the Oaks like all the time. That was his ministry place. So he was up at the Oaks, and he was in the restaurant having a drink or sharing time with friends, and there was someone at the bar who was, for some reason, found out Tom wore a collar, so he was pretty easy to identify. Someone noticed him and started complaining about the church. Right things that happen. I mean, there are some bad experiences that the person had with the church, but they went on, and Tom listened, and then Tom shared this word. This is the part that I've used quite a few times. Tom looked at him and said, I'm really sorry that the church has hurt you so much. But I'd be very cautious to be so critical of the church if I was you. Because God sure loved her a whole lot. And that for me, hearing it from Tom, was a moment to say, what a beautiful way to bring the glory of God's people before someone that didn't quite see it. May God paid a high price to gather His church. God's heart is so deeply in love with His people. Right now, you and I, we see the people of God with scaffolding and ropes and blue tarps kind of hung up because there's a construction zone going on. And it's not always pretty, right? I'm not always pretty, and neither are you. But we are together under construction for the glory of the King, and one day the scaffolding will come down, the blue tarps will come down, and we're going to hear our King say, "Welcome, my bride. I've been waiting for you for a long time. And you look gorgeous without spot, without blemish, my people. I'll be your God and you'll be my people forever and ever and ever." In the grind of the days under construction, guys, don't ever lose sight of the glory of the church. And it's not just FCCB. It's Journey. And it's Be Free. And it's Grace. And it's the churches in this area, and the churches in South Korea, and the churches under oppression in North Korea and China. And it's the churches exploding in South America. And it's God's people everywhere in which He's placed His presence and His glory. And so there will be hurt. And there will be sin. And there will be reconciliation that needs to happen in these days. But we catch the picture of the days to come. That the glory of God's people will be revealed fully and permanently forever. It's like all of history is backdrop for this one storyline. I kind of get the sense, and God will reveal one day if this is true, but I sure have the sense, all the headlines coming our way, all the stories in our history books, all the fears we have for the future, all the possibilities, all the dictators, all the presidents, all of history seems to me like a backdrop for what God is really doing. And what God is really doing is bringing folks into His people and then glorifying His people. And one day, all of it will be revealed to us. All of this to say, I hope you walk away from Psalm 48 with this higher view of the church maybe than we've sustained. With a higher view of what God thinks of His city, His people, His church than what we had yesterday. Man, be careful what we say about the church. God delights in you. God delights in us. And it's this picture that drives us forward for the kingdom. To work and to give and to worship. Until one day we hear it. This is my masterpiece. These people who were far from me have been brought close. These people that were a mess have been sanctified. And all of it glorified forever and ever. Let me invite Victor and Gabby up as we close in prayer. Father, I thank you for the picture of sharing your heart for us. I thank you that through it all, your faithful hesed, your loving kindness has never, ever dipped. Even through the prophets, God, you yearn for your people to come back to you. And then you did the most amazing thing. You gave us what was most precious to you. And you laid all of our sin all of our burdens, all of our debt on the shoulders of Jesus on that cross. So that once again, you could be our God and we could be your people, and that you would take our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh. God, may we revel in that glory. May we share your vision of your people. And God, may you equip us with the energy and the strength and the courage to move your mission along for your sake and for your glory and for your name in this region and even to the ends of the earth. May it be so. In Jesus' name, amen.